As is customarily the case after such videos as the previous one regarding Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, there have arisen many misunderstandings as they pertain to my ideas about a pill that would fundamentally change human beings. For one thing, it was a complete hypothetical. It's part of a bigger issue. Now, the most common thing I've seen in the comments is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And yes, I've read it twice, many years ago and a few years back. And Soma, I'm advocating Soma, this very addictive drug that was present in this dystopian fantasy. One thing I'd like to say off the bat, and something I find quite fascinating, is that there's a predilection human beings have to project a degree of accuracy taken from dystopian novels such as Brave New World onto reality, which is to say, somehow the constituent parts of Brave New World map onto reality, if not perfectly, accurately enough so as to make some sort of somewhat precise prediction regarding the future, which is to say, talking about biochemical manipulation vis-a-vis medication, something that we already do, will open the pathway to a sterile, no pun intended, regarding Brave New World, and just sort of dead world, the world presented to us in Aldous Huxley's novel. I'm not sure if people who make these comments think it's insightful, but I mean, it is a dystopian fictional novel, and nobody can predict the future. So that's the first thing I'd like to say in addressing this issue. Now, we have been chemically enhancing ourselves for a long, long time, even before the 20th century. And we have a natural tendency as human beings to do this. I've mentioned this before, and I mentioned in the previous video. Food, different types of food, they're chemicals. They're composed of molecules, and they have a different effect on your body and your mood, depending on the type of food you eat. So if you eat 2 pieces of chocolate cake, whatever your individual metabolism might be, your body's going to react very differently to that compared to, say, eating 5 fried eggs. Insulin response will be different. Hormonal balance will be different as a consequence. It's just going to be vastly different. And so we already manipulate ourselves vis-a-vis food, even though it's not conscious. And there are so many different types of drugs on the market that change things. Now, yes, the pill, you could call, rightly so, biochemical manipulation. But having studied human beings for quite some time now, it seems after so much time that all we're doing is really just running in circles, doing the same thing we have always done. And this begs the question, if moving forward, if we want to progress as a species, and I could define progression as moving past these more burdensome aspects that we all bear within us, if it behooves us to continue running around in circles, like headless chickens. Another comment, or several comments I saw, suggest the idea that I was likening the human condition to that of a disease. No, I'm not. However, one thing I've stressed for years now is that the human condition and native human psychology is essentially maladaptive with regards to the current environment. There are so many examples and instances of this. It seems almost silly that I would mention it again, but think about the reproductive game that most people play. Think about the types of foods we eat in the modern environment. All these things have consequences, and because evolution takes place at a relatively slow rate, we can't adapt well to this newfangled environment, and so there are consequences we suffer, be it health consequences, the problems in so-called relationships and marriage. We are running around in circles doing the same thing we've always done. And many of us have gotten in our heads that this is just, it's good enough, it's sufficient. That stumbling about, lost essentially, is the best way forward. Now, alternatively, what people do, and this is part of our native psychology, is create these ideologies. They haven't really improved human beings' lot very much. Quite the contrary, as I pointed out, the 20th century has been littered by corpses, the mausoleum of ideology, if you will. Variations of communism, National Socialism, even the internecine conflicts that existed between so-called capitalist nations like the United States and Vietnam. And this was a combination of different things. And it might be the case that human beings, on the whole, in their totality, cannot live without ideology. Most cannot, at least. Or a narrative that they tell themselves. But it doesn't vitiate the idea that we would, as a whole, be best served by moving past that, because we can see the damage that it wreaks upon us. And it's just not really worth it, to my viewpoint. Obviously, plenty of people think ideology is great and having a narrative is great. And I fully admit that my own inability to believe every narrative, and I'll get to the alleged claim that I believe in scientism, lends itself to me proffering and supporting these ideas, transhumanist ideas. On the claim that I've heard many times that I am a believer in scientism, no, science is imperfect. In fact, many times I've talked about on my channel, I've even hosted a discussion with an actual practicing scientist, a friend of mine, a geneticist, citing the many problems in scientific research in the current year or the previous year. It's not perfect, it's far from it, but it is certainly better than the science of the past, which was voodoo, witch doctory, witchcraft, pleading to the gods. Whatever we've done, however imperfect and fallible science might be, as well as the scientists and human beings that practice science might be, it's better than what we had before. And most people, I'd argue, would be hard-pressed to want to return to that primitive state where the witch doctor was the cure for your fractured knee. Or when you had coronary problems, well, that was it, game over. Science, anatomy, the study of medicine, all these things come together holistically, I would argue. And it's not perfect, but it's the best we have. Yeah? I mean, what alternative is there? I don't see returning to the past, although there are some people who want to see everything burn and would love to return back to some past a few hundred years ago or even further, whereby, the traditionalism lives on and we all live short, brutish, and I'd argue even more meaningless lives than the current lives that we lead. But getting to the point of, once again, this idea of chemical manipulation, this is nothing new. We do it all the time, and it's going to happen regardless. It's happening very slowly. We certainly haven't invested as much time as I like us to invest, and money for that matter, in fine-tuning these things. As I said in the previous video, the things we have right now, the medications and what have you, these are to be likened to, the cudgel, the wooden javelin in terms of warfare. They're primitive. We haven't really worked on it very much. Some things we understand relatively well. So, for example, if you inject synthetic testosterone, we know what's going to happen, more or less, in most cases. We know there'll be a down-regulation of the endogenous testosterone in the testicles, etc. I mean, some things we understand. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, less so, and they tend to be much more hit or miss. But just as warfare progressed beyond cudgel and javelin and bow and arrow, eventually, I think it's almost an inevitability that neurochemical manipulation, for example, and the means of doing it, and the precision by which these drugs operate will improve in time too. Most of us probably won't live to see it. I probably won't. But the point I'm trying to make is that we know, as I pointed out, we are meat bags that interact with an environment, biological organisms that interact with an environment. You can argue that an ideology is part of an environment. I would accept that. And you can also argue that a belief system or narrative is part of an argument, of an environment. But The point I'm trying to make here is simply that running around in circles and telling ourselves narratives, whether or not this is a constant and we're stuck with this, being stuck with this psychology, which we might very well be, is irrelevant and not germane to my argument here. Is that there's just abundant evidence looking at history that that doesn't work. Yet on the other hand, not everyone does well, say, with SSRIs or benzos or what have you, but some people do well with them, and some people are helped by various drugs that affect our neurochemistry. There are people with testosterone deficits, and people who abuse it, obviously, as well, who benefit from synthetic testosterone. These are minor examples. Once we understand and refine our comprehension of the brain to a much greater degree, because let's be honest, neuroscience in many ways is still in its infancy. The neuroscientists that I've occasionally talked to have told me as much, and based on my limited understanding as interested layperson, this seems to be the case. We need to give it time, but increasingly we live in this world that's just filled with one ideology being pitted against the other. Now, I know a lot of people will claim, once again, that I believe in scientism, or not believing in something is an ideology, but like I said, I don't think science is perfect, but it's the best tool that we have, more or less. As far as not believing in something or not believing in a narrative, well, I guess not believing in leprechauns means something too. Neither here nor there. The point I tried to make in the previous video, and I'm reiterating here or reinforcing, is that whether it's a fixed quality or not, I don't think as a species we would be well advised to continue running around these same circles when we can have a much more directed sense of progress. Yeah, maybe it would end up like Soma or some other drug. I mean, people bring up heroin. Yeah, there are all kinds of drugs with negative consequences. This is a consequence to me, to my mind, of a either intentional or malicious intent, in the case of, say, heroin and manufacturing some kind of drug, that people know is addictive and destructive of one's health. But in many cases, it's just ignorance. We just don't understand enough. And I don't think that because Aldous Huxley, I think it was in 1931, I believe, wrote a book about some dystopian horror story, effectively, of how society could turn out, that is an accurate future prediction of what will be. I mean, this trend I've seen for years. Oh, that sounds like Brave New World. This sounds like this. Maybe not. This sounds like Animal Farm. I mean, I'm talking about all these novels. Yeah, some of it's great fiction, but we don't know what's going to happen. And if you at least accept, and I'm accepting the possibility that maybe this is all a fixed quality, you could at least entertain the idea that accepting ourselves as biological organisms whose entire sense of well-being, fulfillment, etc., is a product of an environment that interacts with that biology could move us forward a great deal. On a final note, none of this should be compulsory. I mean, I've had these discussions many times, say, with Coltrane. He differs vastly and greatly from me in this regard. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about, enhancing yourself, transhumanism, augmentations, if you want to use Deus Ex terminology. We've had this discussion. He'd rather, cook his carrots, meat, chicken, and potatoes and enjoy the meal and shit it out as a slimy paste. My preference would be to swallow a pill that would cover all my caloric needs, as well as my macro and micronutrient needs in the morning, and then just be done with it. I'm not really a hedonist like he is. I don't live for pleasure, hardly. And if anything, I feel trapped and needlessly confined by my physiological needs. I find them irritating, to say the least, and horrifying sometimes in the worst case scenario. But I would never say, well, now that this pill is out, that everyone should be strapped down to a bed, chained, if you will, and then, just swallow. It should be voluntary. You can see a shrinkiologist and say, look, doc, I've run out of options. Give me a benzo, or give me an SSRI. I mean, you don't have to. You can see a shrinkiologist and not accept any medication, even though legally he's in a position as a medical doctor to prescribe something to you. And that's the way I would look at this too. This kind of thing, experimental medication, if we want to call it, if we ever advance that far, would be something optional for people who made a decision to take it. But it shouldn't be forced down people's throats, no pun intended, or swallowed, or whatever. People can choose what they want to do. Even in the fictional world of Deus Ex, no one is forced to take on augmentation. Some of them accept them for the sake of a better life, and of course there's a sort of shadowy elite behind it all, and I'm sure people would invoke that here too. But I just, if we want to talk about hope for humanity, most people's conception of that is a regression to what used to be. But what used to be can only be achieved if we level everything that we have now. And we're not doing a very good job of dealing with what we have now. Certainly in some ways better than in earlier times. We're not dropping atomic bombs. Warfare, though perhaps in terms of its reporting, seems fairly common activity. Not quite as bloody as it used to be, if anything, because the human element, at least on the delivering side, has been removed. But things are better. It's obvious that we could do better. I mean, for example, this is a minor example. When I used to work in a warehouse, as many of you know, years ago, back in the days of early Stardust, almost 3 years, I had to stand on my feet a lot. I have flat feet. I went home always in pain. I finally got insoles. It didn't help that much. These days, as I work from home, doing various activities, I don't say I have the same issue even when I'm walking, but would I prefer not to have flat feet if the option were available? Of course. And there are people out there of different stripes who feel, say, paralyzed by depression, or there's just something wrong with their brain. I saw an interesting documentary, a Dutch documentary, although there were subtitles because my Dutch isn't that good to understand all the fine details sometimes, of a young woman who just had no desire to live. Everything was just sort of a pain, not a clear pain, mind you, not a physical, but a miasma in her mind, as it were. And of course, in Holland, you have voluntary, you can engage in euthanasia. I don't know if she took that decision. It's not clear towards the end. If I'm trying to remember, it's a while back. Now, clearly, this type of person doesn't choose this. But what if she could take a pill that would fix that? I mean, it's a vastly different example from, say, having flat feet and preferring not to have flat feet like I have. But so obviously, an ideology is not going to serve a person like that. And for some people, it will. But look at the conflict that arises from that. Of course, I'm talking about things on an individual level, a micro level rather than macro level, which is the point. I don't think everyone should be tied down and fed the equivalent of soma. But I think as a species, at least individually, we should support further investigation into the human brain, physiology, psychology, in order to create options for people who want to have them, who don't want to rely on narratives that may or may not, in many cases, do not map onto the reality we live in, but want to live contented, productive lives. I mean, that's essentially what I'm talking about. Now, I hope I've made this abundantly clear here. Maybe I haven't. If anything had been ambiguous in the previous video, I hope I've rendered the ambiguity somewhat null here. Regardless, everyone, I wish to thank you for tuning in, and more to come. And as always, whatever gods you may choose to worship, may they watch over you. Enjoy the rest of your week. Take care, and bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.